Hello, my name is D.I.Griggs, and I'm going to present African American Homesteaders. I'd like to welcome you to the class, and today you will learn how to search the Bureau of Land Management to see if your ancestors owned land. You will also see copies of original documents and land plat maps, as well as other resources regarding the homestead process. You will also begin to understand how the Homestead Act affected the freedmen in particular, and a bit of the United States historical events surrounding them. The topics in this class will also reflect how your family's history might bring more clarity into your genealogy research. Throughout the presentation, I will use the words freedmen, black, and slaves when referring to African Americans. Now, let's begin. But first, just a little bit about myself, which is also in the class syllabus. I've been researching genealogy for over 40 years, particularly my family, while also teaching others how to research their family history. One line of my maternal ancestry traces back to 8th century England and through DNA to the kingdom of Dahomey, which is present-day Benin in Africa. Now let's begin the class on African American homesteaders. Now let's dispel a myth. Many people believe that most blacks didn't own land during slavery or after emancipation, and that most were only poor sharecroppers. The truth? Yes, blacks did own land before and after emancipation, and we have the proof. The proof is at the National Archives, also known as NARA, the National Park Service, in the U.S. Federal Census records, and state and county courthouses where your ancestors lived. Before and after emancipation, there were other ways to obtain land. Some were the free people of color. They owned land during slavery, some by manumission of their former slave owner or by a slave owner's will. The children of a slave owner and a slave, they were sometimes given land or money to purchase land in another state and give them an education. Other times it was an inheritance from a parent or spouse. The colored soldiers' pay, plus many had other skills. Freedmen who were able to use their skills and earn extra money. And the Homestead Acts before and after 1863. Several members of my family own land too, by either purchasing it or through the Homestead Act, and that land is still in our family today. According to the History Network, by 1870, only around 30,000 freedmen in the South owned small plots of land, compared with 4 million other blacks who didn't own land at all. According to the National Park Service, by 1900, 6,500 blacks had filed for a homestead, but only 1,000 had received land ownership. Some were cheated out of their land, unjustly taxed, ran out of town, and murdered for it. However, just the fact that many freedmen, men and women, did something to try and earn land. However, the myth still prevails that blacks could only settle for becoming sharecroppers, deceived into thinking that working for someone else, such as former slave owners, that they would share in the profits from the land. Rarely did they receive any profits promised because of having to pay high interest rates, rising store credits for tools and seed, therefore pretty much keeping them impoverished as a newer form of slavery. Now, we'll look at the reasons for the Homestead Act of May 20th, 1862. President Abraham Lincoln signed the May 20th, 1862 Homestead Act to encourage settlement of public land west of the Mississippi River. They were wanting to avoid expansion of slavery. It was meant for people to establish small individually owned farms and work for themselves. Those who applied could claim up to 160 acres per person. Also in 1862, as the war raged on, Lincoln's military tactic was that if the 11 Confederate states didn't end their rebellion and return to the Union, he would free their slaves on January 1st, 1863, the exact same day that the Homestead Act was to begin. Looking at the homestead eligibility, it was kind of rigorous. You had to be men and women, single, married, or widowed. You had to be the head of a household or 21 years old. It was not to be based on race. You had to be a citizen or an immigrant who had already filed for citizenship, had never taken up arms against the federal government, actually meaning the Confederate States, build a dwelling place or house, maintain residency for at least 5 years, and farm the land each season. Making improvements was called proving up, and that meant to clear the land, build structures like corn cribs, barn, smokehouses, and fencing. However, for the freedmen, they were not eligible to apply for a homestead on the day it began, even though they were emancipated, because citizenship didn't come with emancipation. It took several years before the freedmen would gain citizenship in order to apply for the land. 2. The Homestead Act did not apply to Native Americans as they were not citizens either. Besides, it was their former land that was available for others to homestead. There were other required stipulations of the homestead process. The claimant had to complete an application plus pay a small filing fee. After meeting all requirements of living on the land for a minimum of 5 years and proving up the homestead, the claimant had to post a notice of publication in a local newspaper for several weeks stating that they had an intent to file a claim. They had to include the name of the witnesses who could prove what they had done, as well as a description of the land. They also had to have a minimum of 2 witnesses to accompany them to the nearest land office to testify that the claimant completed the homestead requirements and what was done to prove up the property. Most of the time, it was the exact same words as the claimant. Once the application was approved, the claimant received the land patent confirming the property is theirs. There is a note about travel time. Sometimes the nearest land office was almost 90 miles away. More than likely, the claimant had to save up the money for them and their witnesses to go. One land office was in New Orleans, approximately 72 miles away from one claimant. To walk that far takes 22 hours, or by train almost 2 hours. So it could have taken 1 to 2 days round trip to be away from their farms in order to testify. No doubt they had to pay for their witnesses to travel with them. As a side note, anyone who saw the post of notification also saw the names of the witnesses and certainly knew if they were black or white. They were their neighbors. Sometimes before any testified, there might have been attempts at witness intimidation and threats or acts of violence. Many times a claimant would list 4 to 5 names of witnesses when they only needed 2, yet and still they persisted. As we all know, there are always exceptions to the rule. The Union soldiers could deduct the time they had served in the Army from their residency requirements. Not all could join the army, and if others wanted the land, they would have to pay $1.25 per acre and reside on the property for a minimum of 6 months. The main exception: Native Americans could not participate as the federal government was giving away their land. They couldn't become citizens until the Dawes Act of 1887, and they had to enroll in the 5 civilized tribes and assimilate into the American way of life. Unfortunately, many whites believed that all native peoples were nomads and only those who owned land could use it effectively and efficiently. However, the Indians believed that the land belonged to the community and not to individuals. Still, African Americans persisted. As mentioned before, citizenship didn't come with emancipation. These newspaper articles reflect some of the problems. Many felt that the freedmen could not make it on their own without any skills or supervision. The truth is that many slaves were skilled carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers, tanners, and experienced farmers, yet they still faced stiff competition for earning money or owning land after emancipation. Citizenship would take several years, and the Freedmen's Bureau wasn't established until March 1865 to assist the freedmen in their transition from slavery with legalized marriage, banking, education, disputes over work contracts, and the demand of back pay for the colored troops. Next, we'll take a look at the impact on immigration for homesteading. As you can see from this newspaper article, we can tell how immigration affected the freedmen in both owning land and employment aspects throughout the United States, and not just after emancipation. The largest groups immigrants coming to America were from Ireland, Germany, and England between 1820 to 1860. 75% of them settled in the East and Midwest, according to this article, in already established towns, and some went south to open businesses and become slave owners. Now, this is a good tip for uncovering a slave owner in the state where your ancestors were enslaved. Census records and other city and state histories might state where they were born, such as what city, town, state, or the country they immigrated from, and their own family histories online. And then it happened. With the death of Abraham Lincoln, a week after the Civil War was ended in April 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated. Surely the freedmen must have been apprehensive and concerned. Would their good fortune be reversed? Would they be enslaved once again, even though slavery was supposedly illegal in 1863? Would they ever become citizens and own land? What about the 40 acres and a mule promised from Special Order 15 that was recently signed by General Sherman? What would the next president do? It wasn't long before they found out. This land was the 400,000 acres that was confiscated federal land in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and the mules were supposedly government surplus. Although Abraham Lincoln eventually agreed with it, it was only a promise of a non-governmental act. Special Order 15 was soon rescinded by Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson. Those who had received 40 acres and a mule had to relinquish it, but most never received it at all. Very few were able to keep some of the land let alone a mule. One can only imagine the predicament the freedmen were in with so much anger and hostility towards them by many angry former slave owners, including the Southern Democratic Party. Although not all states agreed to it, three important life-changing Reconstruction amendments were added to the Constitution. In 1865, slavery was abolished in the U.S. unless convicted of a crime as simple as vagrancy. Many blacks had to be aware of being in groups or were deemed troublemakers. The 14th Amendment was passed in 1866 and it gave the black man citizenship. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, giving men the right to vote no matter the color of their skin, except the Indians and the Chinese. Now let's look closer at the 14th Amendment. What did the 14th Amendment mean to the former Confederate states and the freedmen? As you can see from this article, it claims that the federal government controls citizenship. The former Confederate states were divided into 5 military districts and controlled by the Union Army, except Tennessee. Before readmission to the Republic, each of these states had to draft a new state constitution that had to be approved by Congress. And each state had to ratify the 14th Amendment that every person born in the U.S. was a citizen and not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, again, except for the Indians and the Chinese. All that our ancestors had to endure just to be free, a citizen, and get the opportunity to vote. In those same southern states they were slaves, now they would be able to apply for a homestead, raise their family, and sharecropping was not the only option. Now that the freedmen were citizens in 1866, another act came up in 1867 in the southern states that gave the black man the right to vote. The freedmen first voted in 1867 and they voted Republican for all the assistance to the freedmen that were in Congress. They knew that the Southern Democrats didn't want any part of this. However, with potential trouble all around them, freedmen still took the initiative and voted many blacks into public office from the local level all the way to the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. At their own personal risk, the freedmen's vote kept the Republican in power. But also, due to the three main amendments, trouble awaited the freedmen. They had to endure the rise of terroristic groups like the Invisible Empire, which eventually became the Ku Klux Klan, the White Cappers, Knights of the White Camellia, the Red Shirts, the White Leagues, all of the domestic terrorists that eventually spread across the South and eventually to the White House. This included President Warren Harding, Woodrow Wilson, President McKinley, Calvin Coolidge, and President Harry S. Truman. Still, acts of violence, lynchings, murders, and intimidation prevail, especially in the South and some in the North, yet the freedmen still filed for homesteads. Some succeeded and some didn't due to the intimidation, murders, and frauds. Now let's take a look at the records of the homestead documents for freedmen who prevailed. These original homestead documents were filed in a file for Mississippi. It was filed in 1871 for 157.38 acres by Peter Hunt, who was my great-great uncle. He paid a filing fee of $14, and that was not minimal at that time. In today's money, $14 would be $318. After the 15th Amendment passed for the voting rights is when he filed. I'm not sure if that actually means anything or not. The 157 acres in rural Mississippi that he obtained at that time is now worth over $500,000, and his family still lives on it. This is a copy of the newspaper notice for publication that each claimant had to file. On this particular one, it's for Peter Clark. He was the great-great-grandfather of Bernice Alexander Bennett. If you notice, the land office is in New Orleans, and he lives 72 miles away from New Orleans. He also lists his witnesses by name, and you might find out who they were. Were they family? Were they friends or neighbors? How and why did they want to go and be a witness for Peter Clark and travel that long distance? Because they had to be there the same day. But this notice had to be published for several weeks, so everyone knew who the witnesses were. And so you'll find out in the later documents who in fact did go to the office with him. I didn't have one for Peter Hunt nor for my third great-grandmother, but this one is very interesting too. And you can read about it in Bernice's book, Black Homesteaders of the South. This document is a copy of the claimant discussing her proving up on the homestead. It was for America Herald for 39.35 acres. She originally filed in 1883, and it was 2 years after her son Peter received his patent. So I kind of have a little idea about something, and I'll bring it up a little later, about why she waited until that particular time. It also, no, you can't tell on this particular copy, she did have two other men to verify her approving up, J.M. Halford and G.C. George Columbus Adams. I have a sneaky hunch who this Adams man is in relation to my family, and I'm going to check with him. If you take a look at it, some of her statements might reveal new information, things I didn't know about, and long-held secrets. Well, guess what? I found out both secrets and new information. You can see how she tells them what she did to prove up on the homestead, and her claimant, Joe Turner, almost said it precisely the way she said it. One interesting note, she lived in a 16 by 16 square foot house, not very large. She only used 15 acres of it for farming corn and potatoes, which she still had, but they sold the cotton every year. And she had a bed, a bureau, chairs, and a table, and the value was $25. But her total value for everything, including her animals and equipment, totaled $130. $130 in today's value is a little over $4,000. And those 39 acres in Mississippi now sells for $163,000. This document I copied quite a few of the answers that Joe Turner gave for his witness statement. And there's really good genealogy information on those, on this particular document as well as the other ones. It talks about how long he's known her, who her neighbors were, that she, in fact, is the claimant, and knows when she moved on the land in 1883, and exactly, almost verbatim, what she did to prove up the property. Now we're going to show you how to go to the Bureau of Land Management and search for your own records. Now, I want you to see exactly what that website looks like, because a lot of people will type in blm.com.org, but it's actually .gov. It's a government website. You can either go to this one or go directly to the website listed next to check out the GLO records. This is the page that will come up when you check out the records. I call it the search page or the search engine. Don't let it scare you. The only thing you have to fill out is 2 or 3 things. You want to search by state, like I would go to Mississippi. I know that my family lived in Franklin County, so I would type that in. I knew the last name for Peter Hunt, so I put his last name and his first name, as well as America. And so then all you do is just press the little orange button at the bottom to see what will come up, or if anything comes up. Now, if it comes up no matching records are found, don't give up. Just go back to the search page, choose a state, but leave the county blank. You still have to put a last name in, but not a first name. So you'll get an assortment of names, but from there you will be able to sort them by name, date, and county to make it easier. Remember that when you're searching those particular states and counties, some of them were on borderlines. An example being Crosby, Mississippi. It was once part of Amite County, then it was part of Wilkinson County, then it was part of Franklin County. Now it's back in Amite County. So don't worry about it. And another thing, as far as America, I know her name is to be spelled Harrell, but the land office spelled it Harrold. So that really let me know that to pronounce it, it was Harold, but not Harold as in a man's name. This is what will come up when you do find a name that you know. You can also sort it here by last name. Since it's only one, I didn't have to do it. And by date. If several come up, you can sort that date. So for African Americans, you can look for dates after 1863. And you can also sort it by county if more than one name comes up. Notice the session number in blue. That's the one you click on for more information on the homesteader. When you press on that blue accession button, this is what will come up. For Peter Hunt, it came up where the land office was, the date that he received his patent, the description of the property, what authority it was purchased under, and it's the Homestead Act of May 20th, 1862. The document number or the certificate number for the patent, how many acres, and if you notice on the right side of the page is a copy of the actual land patent. It was signed by President James Garfield. These are the documents for America Herald. It's spelled Harold again, but it should have been Harrell. She was my third great grandmother, as well as Peter's mother. The difference is the description of her land that was just a little over 39 acres, and the president that signed hers was Benjamin Harrison, and apparently it was days before he left office. Now, if you go back to your genealogy and look at the census records, you can prove whether your ancestors owned land or didn't. Now, in 1880, it doesn't state that the land was owned, but it lists Peter, his wife Emily, and his mother America, and one of his sisters, his youngest sister, was living with him. But there's no mention about land ownership, even though Peter filed in 1871. Now, there isn't a census for 1890 since it was burned. In 1900, now we find that Peter, he's still living with Emily, but his Aunt Harriet is there as his mother, America. She's now deceased. She died right about 1885, 86. Peter owned the land at that time, but it's mortgaged. Is it possible that the 2-year difference between him receiving his land grant and his mother filing, that he mortgaged his land in order to help his mother set up for her property? So she needed land and seed for the land, wood, tools, animals, and equipment for her property. And then in 1910, Peter is now living with his niece Louisa as he's widowed. Emily died in 1907, and in 1910, Peter's land is free and clear. Peter died in 1915, so he won't show on the 1920 census. These are two samples of county land plat maps. The one on the left, a friend of mine who is a retired geologist obtained this plat map for me to reflect where some of my ancestors lived, whether by homestead or land purchase. It reflects Peter's property, his mother America's property, also the father of America's 3 grandchildren. He lived next door to them. And also, the plat reflects where my great great grandfather Deck had bought his property in 1896. The other plat map reflects the same thing. It's just easier to read, and it lists the original landowners. That's why this was created, and this is online for a monthly fee, and that information is right beneath it. Where to go to obtain this? You can also buy it online. Um, the company Arfax Publishing has gathered all these maps from different counties and states and put the First Landowners Project in it, but it's kind of costly to do it that way. I only needed it for 3 months, and they gave me permission to use the information. Now, there were other events that influenced African American homesteaders. These newspaper articles about Westward movement that some black homesteaders took advantage of. More immigrants were arriving for the same opportunities to own land and secure employment and beginning their own businesses, some to sell primarily to blacks rather than blacks being allowed to sell to their own people. As you can see on that third article, it was about the steel industry in New York forming a larger company. So the blacks were moving not only west but east as well, rather than staying to sharecrop or farm. Some of the westward opportunities for blacks, they left to begin all black towns and communities elsewhere. There was a lot of movement to the Great Plains states in 1880, such as Nicodemus, Kansas, DeWitt, Nebraska, Sully County, South Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And there's a picture of Blackdom, New Mexico, but that's about the only thing that remains. Some left to work and live in black communities across the U.S. There were anywhere from 80 to 200 towns that were started by blacks, but they're now extinct. They eventually folded. There were freedmen who either resided in Oklahoma or those who went there who built over 50 black towns, but only 13 remain today. At one time, they were saying Oklahoma was going to be the state for blacks when the Native Americans were already there in allotted land. Many left for employment opportunities in other states, like I said, to the north, to the east, and to the west. The steel mills, car manufacturing, railroads, shipyards, other manufacturing towns. So they were working to try and provide for their families wherever they could. And in total, 30 states participated in homesteads, so anyone can search for their ancestors from 1863 to 1976, the years of homesteading before it was repealed. Now, what should be our call to action? We should check our ancestors who might have filed for a homestead. Use sites like FamilySearch.org, which is free, or Ancestry.com, which will cost some money. You can go to the Bureau of Land Management and check for the homesteads there. Verify it's your ancestor through other source documents and records, such as, again, Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org, the United States Federal Census Records, the U.S. Colored Troops Pension Papers, the National Archives Records and Administration, or NARA, Fold 3, newspapers.com, and attending genealogy classes and seminars like this one that comes every year. You can order the copies of your homestead files through the National Park Service, NARA, or from Genealogy Friends. Bernice Bennett is one of those, and she lives on the East Coast. So, for a small fee, but only if you will agree to write the story about your ancestors' homestead, she will go to NARA, retrieve copies of the original homestead files, scan, email, or mail the copies to you. And then these records will be posted on the National Park Service website and a shout out on the Descendants to African American Homesteaders Facebook page. You should join the Facebook page for the Descendants of African American Homesteaders for the template to form and write your own story. Then the story will be submitted to the National Park Service to be verified and placed online with other homesteader documents. As you can see, there's the website to check the Black Homesteading in America. There are already stories on there. My stories are on there. Quite a few people are on there. And you can read it to see how or how we've all put our stories out there. Now, we're going to go to the Descendants of Homesteaders Facebook page. On the Descendants of African American Homesteaders, you'll actually see the map. The states in brown, those are the states that offered homesteads. And the states in blue, they're the ones who didn't offer homesteads, even if your ancestor went north and east to work in manufacturing companies. Still, there's a lot of genealogical information you can get from other records pertaining to your ancestors. Although there were many who tried and failed due to circumstances, yet they are to be celebrated for even trying to claim land through the homesteads and vote as U.S. citizens. There are many other African Americans that we are certainly proud of, like educators, ministers, chefs, civil rights proponents, sportsmen and women, inventors, scientists, and yes, in our lifetime, a Black president and Black female vice president. It wouldn't have been possible except for those noble ancestors who dared to risk it all for our freedoms today. We say thank you. Thank you for attending our class. And remember, our ancestors have shown us that when plans fail, redirect your efforts and never ever give up. Thank you for attending. Goodbye.